Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to this session today on terrorism in the shadow of the pandemic, a pressing need for integrated responses. My name is Fiona, and I am the project manager of the UNDP Africa Regional Project on Prevention and Response to Violent Extremism in Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of the Aswan Forum for the invitation to moderate this session today. One of the main takeaways from the COVID-19 pandemic is that it is not only a health challenge, but it also has a significant effect on the socio-economic fabric of our societies and is at its core a governance challenge. While the long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on terrorist trends are yet to be seen, and we continue to do research and analysis, on the short term, the pandemic has really exacerbated the threat of terrorism. Drawing from analysis done by UNDP in collaboration with the Lake Chad Basin Commission and the African Union, as well as the Aswan Forum's chair summary from June 2020, I would just like to highlight some key points to frame this session. In the Horn of Africa, Al-Shabaab has continued to pose significant risks to civilian populations in the region, especially in Somalia and Kenya. The security situation in the Lake Chad Basin region began deteriorating in late 2019, further accelerated with the onset of COVID-19 and coincided with increased attacks against local communities and the killing of Muslim civilians, which was a departure from ISWAP's Swimming Hearts and Minds strategy. In terms of general violent extremism trends, we have also witnessed increased spread of risks in Southern Africa, Northern Mozambique, and noted emerging risks in Malawi and the Comoros, which warrant further analysis, although it's important to stress that the links with COVID-19 are not clear, but just to highlight the increasing risks and spread of VE. In terms of recruitment efforts and master narratives, as COVID-19 illuminates governance deficits, violent extremist organizations have increased efforts at radicalization towards violent extremism, particularly in online spaces globally, and are making efforts to provide a more efficient alternative to the government. And we see this particularly where there are vacuums in terms of governance. Stepping up efforts, for example, in June 2020, Al-Shabaab announced the setting up of a COVID-19 treatment center in Somalia. Meanwhile, in some areas, terrorist organizations face the dilemma of granting access to humanitarian and health actors in the territories they control. We have also seen that COVID-19 amplifies misinformation, false religious narratives, and hate speech. The onset of COVID-19 provided opportunities for religious misinformation and false narratives about Islam and COVID-19. For example, in the Lake Chad Basin and Somalia regions. This had an impact on compliance with protective measures and warranted counter-narratives by trusted messengers. There has also been an increase in online and offline hate speech and targeting of groups. We've seen this particularly with returning migrants, foreigners, and so on. It's important to note that COVID-19 has exacerbated underlying structural issues that have been identified as drivers of violent extremism on the continent. In terms of the economic crisis, as the COVID-19 pandemic enters its second year, trends in extreme poverty, food insecurity, and vulnerability have worsened for the first time in 2 decades in the IGAD region. According to the African Union, exports and imports of African countries are projected to drop by at least 35% from the level reached in 2019, and it's forced a downward revision of national budgets in certain countries, for example, Nigeria and Cameroon, owing to the collapse of crude oil prices. We have also experienced disrupted education. This is particularly important when we look at also female students, and that in times of disrupted education, there tends to be a lower return of girl students to school. And also looking at the impacts of religious education. There's been increased marginalization of people and also areas, those in borderlands who have been hard to reach, and clearly a growing digital divide globally. There are also concerns on weakened social cohesion, trust deficits, and erosion of the social contract. While strict provisions such as the states of emergency may may be necessary during a pandemic, concerns arise over new legislation or provisions that have been passed that could be continued to be used to restrict certain freedoms. Within this context, funding trends are of a concern, as the analysis shows that FDI flows to Africa are expected to contract by about 40%. Remittances, which are significant in terms of a source of capital, also are expected to shrink by about 23%, and against the backdrop of rising debt levels on the continent. It is clear from this very brief overview that it is imperative to have holistic, inclusive, and innovative approaches that leverage on partnerships, focus on the most vulnerable groups in society, have gendered approaches, and integrate a PVE lens in COVID response and recovery efforts. Against this backdrop, this session is premised on the imperative of viewing the pandemic as a governance challenge, necessitating an investment in a preventative approach that is based on inclusive governance, strengthening the foundation for sustaining peace and sustainable development. This session, therefore, will examine lessons learned and best practices from peace-building efforts in Africa, which aim to both capitalize on peace dividends and leverage pillars of resilience. On that note, I would like to start by introducing the members of the panel. We have with us today Ghada Wali, Executive Director, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Michelle Konings, Executive Director, Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, Fiona Larton, Acting Director, Peace and Security Director of the African Union, Fonte Akum, Executive Director, Institute for Security Studies, and Fatima Akilu, Executive Director of Neem Foundation. We'll go through key questions to each of the panelists, and then we will accept questions from the floor. Please note, we will not be able to answer all of the questions due to time constraints, but we will do our best. On that note, I would like to start with the first question to Ghada Wali, Executive Director, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Ghada, the growing nexus between terrorism and other transnational threats highlights the need for an integrated and multifaceted response. UNODC's strategic vision for Africa 2030 is centered on African ownership and priorities, and proposes accelerated and enhanced levels of cooperation with Africa in the areas of terrorism, prevention, crime prevention, and addressing transnational organized crime. How will the UNODC strategic vision for Africa 2030 strengthen national capacities and enhance institutional resilience to address the above-mentioned areas of cooperation? How does it propose that African states overcome the challenges posed by the pandemic to achieve the objectives of this vision? Over to you.
Thank you, Nirina. I'm just questioning the organization of the session. Are we supposed to answer the questions, or are we supposed to be giving our speeches first and then go to this question and answer part? Because I was asked to prepare an intervention. Is this a change in the plan, or can you explain a bit how the session will go and be moderated? Nirina, over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Ghada. So Or is Noor, would you like to come in terms of explaining the flow?
Thank you, Your Excellency. The plan is as is, so you can please proceed with your intervention and then also answer the question. Thank you.
What we will do is that we will proceed by giving our speeches, which will be 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will get in the second half of the session, which is questions and answers. Okay, thank you very much. I will proceed as planned. أود أن أعرب عن سعادتي البالغة وفخري بالمشاركة في حدث تنظمه بلدي مصر. وأتقدم بالشكر إلى الحكومة المصرية على دعوتي للمشاركة في هذه الجلسة الهامة. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to be here today to participate in the second Aswan Forum, which is quickly evolving into a valuable platform to discuss and promote peace, security, and development in and for Africa. The pandemic continues to cast a heavy shadow over our world and our aspirations for peace and prosperity in Africa and beyond. Our prospects of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals are in very real danger in this decade of action. The era of COVID-19 has brought forth new challenges and compounded existing ones. It will require more than business as usual to rise up and meet them. Under the dark cloud of the pandemic, terrorism has found a haven to survive and in some cases thrive. Heightened vulnerabilities as well as new tools and technologies are being exploited by this familiar enemy. Physical terrorist attacks have continued to take place while the internet is being used to spread violent narratives and recruit and incite others to commit terrorist attacks. The danger of new and emerging forms of terrorism looms larger than ever, as we find ourselves at greater risk of bioterrorism and cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. The terrorist threat has been further inflamed through linkages with organized crime as recognized by the UN Security Council. Terrorists benefit from cooperation with organized crime, including through financial support as well as provision of weapons, training, and safe havens. Corruption further facilitates terrorist financing, and endemic corruption leaves countries more vulnerable to terrorism. Africa's wealth is being drained away through illicit financial flows, even as the poor and the marginalized are bearing the brunt of the COVID-19 crisis. The global pandemic has had a debilitating economic and social impact, and Africa has been hit hardest. Poverty rates continue to climb far beyond the acceptable, with the pandemic threatening to push 40 million more Africans into extreme poverty. Children are deprived of the right to learn, with over 200 million affected by school closures. Women and girls face greater obstacles to livelihoods and heightened risks of violence and exploitation. Growing disparities and desperate conditions leave victims exposed and give rise to the fears and frustrations that help terrorists to increase their numbers, especially among youth. Such conducive conditions enable terrorists to inflict still more suffering, leaving still more people at risk. In this way, the vicious cycle of terrorism, organized crime, corruption, poverty, and inequality sustains and perpetuates itself. In this hour of need, we cannot let COVID-19 divert attention and resources away from Africa and the fight against terrorism. The UN Security Council high-level debate on cooperation between the UN and the African Union last December called for greater support to Africa to combat terrorism. To do this effectively, we need to promote comprehensive development interventions coupled with robust law enforcement action to identify and disrupt links between terrorist networks and transnational organized crime. At the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, we are firmly committed to integrated, agile, and adaptive responses to assist African member states in their fight against terrorism in this critical time. Building on Unodc's broad mandate dealing with organized crime, terrorism, drugs, and corruption, we provide comprehensive support to strengthen member states' response across the criminal justice chain. We have taken a proactive approach to overcome the limitations imposed by the pandemic from our headquarters in Vienna and network of field offices in the region. We continue to deliver technical assistance and reinforce the capacities of national practitioners and law enforcement officers in combating and preventing terrorism. UNODC trained over 2,000 criminal justice and law enforcement officials online during the pandemic, 720 of whom via our online counterterrorism learning platform. In the Sahel and North Africa, UNODC used this platform to deliver a project on countering the use of the internet for terrorist purposes in 10 countries. In Burkina Faso, a country that has seen an acute increase in terrorism since the start of the pandemic, UNODC has started the development of a national strategy on anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. Moreover, we will soon be launching a project to strengthen national capacities in collecting information from the battlefield to be used as evidence in courts. UNODC also supported Morocco in establishing a national task force to enhance efficient interagency coordination mechanisms and effective operational cooperation to counter terrorism financing. The first line of defense against terrorism are systems that do not discriminate or marginalize. As we enhance counterterrorism capacities, it's equally important to safeguard the rule of law. With this in mind, UNODC continues to provide legal and criminal justice assistance to promote strong, fair, and accountable law enforcement and criminal justice systems. We also work with countries to improve prison management, which can help to prevent radicalization to violence and to support effective offender reintegration. UNODC developed the first UN comprehensive technical guide on the management of violent extremist prisoners and the prevention of radicalization to violence in prisons. More than 20 member states in different regions are currently benefiting from UNODC projects and services supporting efforts to implement this guidance. In Tunisia, UNODC has focused on training frontline prison staff, including on concluding a security risk assessment. And in Uganda, UNODC has supported the development of an effective intelligence sharing structure. Collaborative and intelligence-led criminal justice responses are crucial, as no one country or institution alone can effectively address terrorism and organized crime. To this end, UNODC programmatically supports the efforts of African Union member states to strengthen border management through regional programs and foster cross-border criminal justice cooperation through regional prosecution networks. Moreover, UNODC helped to establish the multi-agency task force for the MENA region, which serves as a platform for the exchange of information on terrorism cases among law enforcement officers and judicial focal points. By way of this task force, a terrorist attack was intercepted while a terrorist suspect was successfully extradited. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we enable countries and criminal justice institutions to cooperate to develop integrated strategies and responses to terrorism, crime and related threats, we must also make prevention a priority and advance holistic approaches, promoting peace, development, and human rights. Individuals and communities must be empowered against terrorism and the various forms of crime and corruption that enable it. Solutions must involve all stakeholders, including the private sector and civil society, working in partnership. People are at the heart of any effective response. This is the philosophy that must guide our efforts and to prevent and combat terrorism. This is also the approach that defines UNODC's strategic vision for Africa 2030, which we launched last week. Coming to your question, Irina, the strategic vision is an evolution of our integrated support to Africa, adapted to the evolving needs of the countries, including those resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. We aim to promote security, prosperity, and health, to preserve the wealth of the continent and enshrine integrity and accountability. One of the key investment areas of our vision is to secure Africa's people from organized crime, terrorism, and violence. We will strive to ensure that those most vulnerable are better protected against these threats. We will pay special attention to children, women, and youth who too often find themselves victims of sexual violence and exploitation. As Africa seeks to benefit from the opportunities provided by new technologies, we will also work with African institutions to protect people from the threats posed by those same technologies, including cybercrime and online exploitation. Excellencies, the shadow of the pandemic has enabled terrorists to regroup in Africa under the cover of its darkness. The crisis has exposed vulnerabilities that we cannot afford to ignore. The key to victory against terrorism, crime, and corruption is to understand that they grow together, fed by inequalities, fragility, and instability. We must ensure that there is no ground for them to take root in our societies and institutions. Sustainability is at the core of the SDGs, as it is the focus of this Aswan Forum. It must be our priority as we build forward from COVID-19. We must seize the opportunity to foster societies resilient to threats, including terrorism, and to get back on track to achieving the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union Agenda 2063. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for sharing the work of UNODC on the continent and also the priorities going forward, looking at resilience, people-centered approaches. I would like to, at this time, take the opportunity, it's an honor, to welcome His Excellency Christophe Joseph Marie Dabire, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso. We're very honored to have you here with us today in this panel. So just to kick off, Your Excellency, you have been leading the Burkinabe government's COVID-19 recovery efforts. The government has undertaken several initiatives to strengthen security and rule of law, as well as communal resilience and social cohesion with the aim of tackling the terrorist threat. A key takeaway from the Aswan Forum 2 preparatory workshop entitled Terrorism in the Shadow of the Pandemic is the imperative for a whole of government approach, whereby governments undertake integrated, coherent, and coordinated policy responses and complement security measures with non-security approaches that invest in preventive and development initiatives. Under your leadership, how is the Burkinabe government balancing efforts of COVID-19 relief and recovery on the one hand, and preventing extremism conducive to terrorism and counterterrorism operations on the other? Thank you. Over to you, Your Excellency. I think we might have lost the connection briefly with the Prime Minister. Just checking in with the organizers. Your Excellency, Prime Minister Dabire, can you hear me? All right, I understand there's an issue with his audio, so we will come back to him. So moving along to the next panelist, this is for Michelle Konix, Executive Director, Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, CTED. We continue to face a complex security landscape and a multi-layered terrorist threat. On the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373, we were reminded that this threat is not what it was 20 years ago. It is changing and evolving. Our response mechanisms, however, have not fully adapted, and our tools and instruments do not always capture this evolution in its entirety. Most recently, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic added an additional layer of complexity to an already volatile terrorism landscape. Notwithstanding, it also provides an opportunity to reflect on existing international and regional responses to terrorism. Your Excellency, against this backdrop, what are the key challenges that need to be addressed to ensure that our terrorism response toolbox is fit for purpose? And how can CTED better support member states in facing this changing landscape? How do you envisage the way forward from this critical juncture? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator and Excellencies, distinguished representatives and colleagues. Allow me to begin by thanking the government of Egypt and its partners for organizing this important event. It's really an honor to be with you all today. I shall briefly address the three elements of the question: the key challenges, the way forward, and the way CTED is supporting the member states. 2021 is a landmark year for CTED and for the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, as it marks 20 years of since tragic events of 9/11, which resulted in the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1373 and the establishment of the committee. As it happens, I also have been working in counterterrorism for the past 2 decades at the national, the regional, and now at the international level. And I personally led CTED's delegation on numerous assessment visits over the last years to this beautiful continent. It's clear that over the 20 past years, member states have made significant progress in countering the global terrorist threat. Many more are continuing their endeavors at this moment. There is now a clear international counterterrorism framework, which is based on a number of Security Council resolutions and 19 UN legal instruments. Those resolutions and treaties set minimum standards for states in a broad range of thematic areas, including inter alia, the countering of the financing of terrorism, law enforcement, border management, and criminal justice. And yet, significant challenges remain. As emphasized in 2 recent CTED analytical briefs, one saw the daylight in June and the other one in December last year, on the short and the mid-term impact of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic is currently our most urgent challenge. Although the pandemic does not appear to have increased the threat posed by ISIL or other terrorist groups in the short term, it has exacerbated many of the underlying issues that fuel radicalization to terrorism. And looking ahead, we are concerned that COVID-related challenges will result in increasingly polarized societies, a global economic downturn, and challenges to governance. We will, in June this year, come out with a new analytical brief underlying the long-term impact of COVID-19 on both terrorism and violent extremism. But of course, prior to the onset of COVID-19, the fundamental factors that fuel terrorism and radicalization to violence continued to plague many regions of the world. And we are particularly concerned by the strengthened ISIL affiliates across Africa, alongside active Al-Qaeda affiliates in certain regions. ISIL affiliates have exploited and exacerbated a deteriorating humanitarian situation in many parts of the continent, including North Africa, the Sahel, and the Lake Chad Basin, and Eastern Africa, and more recently spreading to Southern Africa. Terrorism has become a defining feature for generations growing up in many of these areas where the world's youngest populations live and which have the lowest ranking on the Human Development Indicator scale. And the challenges faced here in Africa are just one element of an increasingly complex and volatile global security landscape. The recent and repeated kidnapping of schoolgirls in Nigeria remains another serious concern, and the Secretary General of the United Nations has called for their immediate and unconditional release and for their safe return to their families. It's clear that states should simultaneously pursue a combination of both hard and soft approaches in dealing with these challenges. But we need to ensure a more effective balance between those two elements than we have often seen over the past 20 years. In conflict-affected regions, security measures are critical in the short term because they enable authorities to restore governance and gain public support and buy-in. However, in the medium to long term, softer counterterrorism approaches are essential to ensuring a holistic approach in addressing multidimensional threats. And there must be a genuine commitment to international cooperation and capacity building, including through the United Nations Counterterrorism framework. As indicated in CTAD's country profile review, 46 countries in Africa are rated between 1 to 50 out of the total performance score of 100, while only 8 countries got into the median range between 50 to 75. Such data show that more must be done to ensure that lower capacity states obtain the support and technical assistance that they need. And that includes continued investment in long-term CVE programming. Like all of you, we at CTAD have also been forced to innovate and adapt to deal with the challenging imposed by pandemic. Our homes became our home offices, and we were really literally all in lockdown, disconnected from the rest of the world. But we are now conducting hybrid country assessment visits that include both virtual and, when COVID restrictions allow, physical components. And we have continued to conduct virtual follow-up deep dive missions on states' developments of advanced passenger information and passenger name records, as well as on other thematic work streams with a view to facilitating the delivery of the provision of technical assistance as identified. Our unique work to identify terrorism-related trends has also continued, including in the context of our ongoing analyses of the impact of COVID-19 on terrorism, counterterrorism, and CVE. These challenges can't be effectively addressed by a single state or an international organization acting alone. It's essential to ensure a whole of society, human rights compliant, gender and age-sensitive approach that ensures cooperation with a broad range of stakeholders. The only way to achieve this is to continue to enhance multilateralism, international cooperation, and partnerships. And I look forward to strengthening our cooperation with the AS1 Forum within the framework of our joint efforts to combat terrorism. I do thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for your remarks, highlighting the challenges, but also looking at recommendations and on terms of the way forward, and in particular, the need to look at analysis, the importance of partnerships and the multilateral system in engaging with national governments and having this whole of society approach in our response. Thank you for that. So we'll move on to the next panelist. I just want to do a quick check-in if the audio of the Prime Minister has been resolved. We can move to him. Someone from the Secretariat can please advise. Okay, not yet. Thank you. All right. So on that note, we will go to the next panelist, Fiona Larton, Acting Director, Peace and Security Director at the African Union. In Africa, terrorism poses a serious challenge to continental and regional security. Today, terrorist groups are using the pandemic as an opportunity to grow stronger by capitalizing on the shift in government attention and resources to face the health crisis, which is evident in the recent surge in terrorist attacks. How does the African Union advance regional and sub-regional counterterrorism efforts and simultaneously support national efforts to address the underlying causes and grievances that contribute to the rise of terrorist groups? Fiona, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, fellow panel members, let me start by expressing my sincere appreciation for the opportunity given to me to address the second edition of the Aswan Forum, representing the Peace and Security Department and the Commission of the African Union. The choice of the theme could not have been better considering the unprecedented impact that COVID-19 pandemic has had on all spheres of life in the continent: social, economic, political, security, and psychological. In my intervention, I will address the impact of the pandemic on terrorism in the continent and highlight the key challenges that member states have faced in their responses and the AU's efforts to assist them. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, terrorism remains a major challenge to peace and security and stability of the African Union member states, as well as globally. It has resulted in overstretching the limited national resources, affecting investments in badly needed national economic development programs, as resources are allocated to the security sector. This impedes the efforts towards the realization of the desired prosperity in the continent. Furthermore, for those countries facing an active terrorist threat, it chases away international and domestic investment, further exacerbating the economic crisis. Various factors contribute to individuals engaging in terrorism and crimes such as drugs and arms trafficking, human smuggling, poaching and wildlife trafficking, piracy, and the proliferation of predatory non-state armed groups. These factors include political marginalization, economic inequality, and extreme poverty, as well as a lack of opportunity, especially for the youth. This situation has been exacerbated by the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. As most member states impose various measures aimed at controlling the spread of the virus, focus was put on enforcing the measures and guidelines set. This placed a burden on law enforcement and other security agencies at the expense of fighting traditional crimes and security threats. Moreover, lockdowns have had a serious impact on economic growth and has increased levels of poverty, which is a known factor in recruitment of young men in particular to terrorist and organized armed criminal gangs. Concern over COVID-19 has captured the attention not only of governments, but also has become topical to terrorist groups. These include Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. Both groups have publicly commented on the virus and even issued a set of Sharia directives to deal with epidemics, advising their members on measures like hand washing and keeping away from affected areas. They have issued statements urging their supporters and affiliates to exploit the situation for recruitment, planning, and stepping up attacks. This is obviously in contrast to the call made by the chairperson of the AU Commission, jointly with the UN Secretary General in March 2020, a call to all warring parties, wherever they may be in Africa and elsewhere, to immediately stop fighting and engage in lasting ceasefire to give a chance to peacemaking efforts, and highlighting that the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic is a call on all humanity to do its utmost to defeat the pandemic. Indeed, reports from the continent show heightened efforts by extremist groups to exploit the situation caused by the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to advance their agendas, entrench their positions in certain communities, extend their tentacles and expand their support base. Terrorist groups in Africa have stepped up attacks in their zones of operations, including those affiliated to the so-called IS, having claimed new territory in Mozambique. As the world at large turned its attention to the COVID pandemic, the battle against terrorism in Africa has taken a deadly turn. According to data from the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, in the first 3 quarters of 2020, the continent recorded over 1,338 terrorist attacks, of which 769 were civilian targets. These resulted in more than 6,356 deaths, of which 3,438 were civilians. This is in comparison with the same period in 2019, where 1,171 terrorist attacks took place and 4,137 deaths were recorded. This therefore represents an increase of 14.26% in the number of attacks and 42.64% increase in the number of deaths. This demonstrates that terrorists did not lose their operational capabilities, but rather that their degree of lethality has increased. Terrorists also continue to exploit the increased use of cyberspace as online presence surged globally as a result of the measures limiting physical contact. Terrorists have also stepped up the use of cyberspace to try to win the hearts and minds of their targets. On the other hand, responses by government to the COVID-19 outbreak has led to reallocation of national budgets, resulting in challenges in provision of basic services. As I said, lockdown, quarantine, and travel restrictions in many states hamper the ability to plan for counterterrorism operations. This is especially challenging in context where pre-existing weak states and poor governance had already provided fertile grounds for terrorist recruitment. Terrorists and extremist groups are taking advantage of the situation to dupe and lure populations by providing pseudo-social services such as healthcare, water, and food in a classic move to win hearts and minds. This is not a new tactic, since ISIS and Al-Qaeda have in the past capitalized on natural disasters as supposed proof that God is supporting them in targeting their enemies, impressing upon followers that if a natural disaster causes this much suffering, terrorist actions can bring about similar destruction using man-made methods. Indeed, the so-called ISIS had initially gloated over the COVID-19 pandemic in its Al-Naba magazine, describing it as a punishment for crusader nations. Terrorists and other criminal networks are also taking advantage of restrictions in movement of goods and people, reduced border surveillance and protection of natural resources in some member states, to engage in illegal exploitation and trade of natural resources, and smuggling of contraband as source of financing for their activities. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, having said all of this, it is important to note that it's not all doom and gloom. The lessons from COVID-19 pandemic should serve as a lesson for us to seize opportunities to harness our efforts towards working holistically and decisively to end violent conflicts on the continent and address their root causes, whether they are as a result of governance deficits, ethnicity, religious differences, or other factors. The pandemic has forced us to face the fact that international policies promoted by international financial institutions, for example, have weakened the state's ability to provide critical social services and public goods, services that are necessary to address both the pandemic and to destroy the ability of terrorist groups to lure marginalized and hopeless youth to their cause. Effort should also be exerted to encourage terrorists and criminals to surrender, especially those who were recruited through coercion. At the same time, there's a need for governments to renew their efforts towards eradication of the root causes conducive to the spread of terrorism and violent extremism, alongside the efforts to encourage cessation of armed conflicts that are plaguing the continent. Being a transnational security threat, there's also a need for increased cooperation and partnership amongst member states, using available resources to share information, data, and intelligence aimed at preventing and combating the threat. Some of the lessons learned from the military response in countries and regions already experiencing terrorism is that military responses should be complemented with non-military approaches. For example, the heavy security response witnessed in the Sahel region should be accompanied with similarly heavy investment in addressing root causes of the conflict in the region, including providing the youth with education and opportunities. This should include reaching out to populations to dissuade them from joining terrorist and extremist groups. Emphasis in addressing political and governance challenges, where poverty, unemployment, and disease is the daily reality, is essential. Ladies and gentlemen, the African Union's main contribution in the fight against terrorism has been to address capacity challenges in member states through training, development of the model laws, sharing of information, creating a set of databases, and providing research through the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism. Another area that we have been involved has been through our mission in Somalia, for example, AMISOM. The AU mission in Somalia has had the degrading of the threat of Al-Shabaab as one of its key mandates. After 13 years of deployment, we are currently, as we speak, negotiating a renewed mandate with the United Nations Security Council. And in doing so, we have recognized the need to move beyond purely military responses, degrading Al-Shabaab by addressing the key governance challenges facing the Somali government itself. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the effective implementation of the relevant policy framework and for the prevention and combating of terrorism and violent extremism in member states, regional economic communities, and the AU as a whole is essential in ensuring a comprehensive response that seeks to address the various security challenges in a holistic manner. Only then can we prevent and fight terrorism in a sustainable manner while ensuring state and human security. On its part, the African Union Commission, including through the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism and AFRIPOL, remains committed to supporting the efforts of member states to fight this common threat to continental and global peace and security as part of its own efforts to silence the guns in the continent. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. And it's good to also see the resonance with some of the other speakers in terms of looking at soft approaches to complement more of the security-focused approaches when we're looking at more of the medium and longer term engagement. Also, worth noting in terms of the increased support, looking at Somalia, and the need for partnerships as we continue to address this challenge. Would now like to go to the next panelist, who is Fatima Akilu, Executive Director, Institute for Security Studies. Terrorist groups have proven to be resilient in an evolving security landscape, and their resilience is linked to their ability to adapt to shocks and crises, such as the current pandemic. As such, our responses should be designed in a manner that aim to protect, empower, and reinforce community resilience by placing a premium on communal grievances and addressing root causes for joining terrorist groups. Against this backdrop, local communities play a critical early warning role and are an important source of information. They hold a unique position that allows them to identify risks and signs of radicalization and extremism conducive to terrorism, as well as complement counterterrorism efforts. In this regard, how can we be better equipped to understand the changing terrorist threat and respond to the ability of terrorist groups to adapt to changing dynamics, especially with the current COVID-19 crisis? Accordingly, how can we ensure that local communities are capacitated in a manner that is centered on communal resilience in the face of terrorist groups? Over to you, Fonte.
Thank you very much, Nerina. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of the ASWAN Forum for the opportunity to contribute to this panel and for the renewed trust in retaining the Institute for Security Studies as a knowledge partner in yet another edition of the ASWAN Forum. The position from which I speak is based on the work that the Institute for Security Studies has undertaken since 2008 to understand violent extremism and terrorism dynamics and responses from the Lake Chad Basin to the Sahel, to the Horn of Africa, and to the emerging front in Southern Africa, particularly the Cabo Delgado region of Mozambique. For these regions and the world at large, the threats posed by terrorism are some of the most pressing and pervasive human security challenges of our time, with root causes being exacerbated by the current COVID-19 pandemic. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to provide a three-part response to the question posed of me today. Firstly, I'd like to identify resilience and adaptability factors, three of which I would underline here today. Secondly, I would like to clarify policy, practice, and programmatic implications of these resilience factors and end up with a number of takeaways. First, based on our research, there are three major resilience and adaptability factors which inherently interconnected. And these exist both within terrorist groups and are external to terrorist groups in connection to the communities, which they themselves are both objects of predation and also actors to a certain extent who provide the resources for this group. So in terms of human resource resilience, these groups have shown extreme resilience when it comes to sustaining their human resource capacity. And in order to address this human resource resilience inherent to violent extremist groups and terrorist groups, we need to understand their recruitment patterns and the numbers of individuals who exist within these groups, as well as the structures within which they operate. Because in fact, we would need to be able to tailor responses and interventions to the different strata of these groups. The foot soldiers would need a different set of interventions from the middle management of these groups and the leadership of those groups. And we have noticed that in cases where terrorist groups' leaders are effectively degraded through military action, most often than not, the group is knocked on a back foot. However, in context where they actually engineer leadership changes from within, the tendency is for them to get stronger and even more resilient. In terms of the second factor, which is economic resilience, violent extremist groups and terrorist organizations have remained resilient in the face of economic challenges, and in fact have shown a lot of resilience in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they have found innovative ways to be financially sustainable by linking up proximate supply chains with long distance supply chains to be able to ensure that they have the material resources to actually exercise violence within the spaces in which they operate. Therefore, in order to effectively tackle economic resilience of those groups, there is the need to look beyond proximate and long distance supply chains, including connections between terrorism, violent extremism, organized crime, and other forms of transnational crime, as has been articulated by the previous speakers here today. In terms of geographical adaptability, violent extremist groups and terrorist groups thrive in border regions of states where they manipulate national and regional borders to their advantage. They operate from a premise where the recruitment of individuals or their supply chains do not necessarily respect national borders, which states are expected to protect. Therefore, understanding these border zones and the communities better in ways that they connect and disconnect would also contribute to enhancing the roles of these communities, to contribute to addressing the multifarious challenges which they face, and will be key to serving a prevention function which goes beyond the response and counterterrorism function. And this needs to be done without necessarily impacting people's freedom of movement, the prospect for greater regional integration, and for regulated trade. Now, enhancing the resilience of communities alone is not an option. Most communities contending with violent extremism and terrorism and attendant forms of violence already live on the geographical and political margins of states. Beyond terrorist-related violence, changing climatic patterns, food insecurity, and displacement put complex pressures on these communities, and they actually exacerbate the pressures that these communities face. These same communities often opt to be the first line of defense through the formation of civilian defense groups or local early warning chapters, and even victims rehabilitation groups. And these efforts that the communities make are often not sufficiently recognized and are often downplayed. It would be important to see ways in which these efforts are actually moved up to scale. And these different factors actually lead to a number of key policy implications. The first is the need for real-time data mutualization and analytical enhancements, which should be the key in designing interventions specifically targeting the different layers of terrorist and violent extremist groups in order to not only promote attrition from within the groups, but to also stem recruitment into their ranks from the same communities that they exploit. The refrain which we often hear from community members in the spaces in which we conduct our research and in which we provide technical assistance is that they coexist with these groups who are their husbands, brothers, sisters, and wives. The communities find themselves, therefore, in delicate dilemma between supporting state interventions in contexts where they are not necessarily guaranteed basic benefits of civil protection, or acquiescing to terrorists who strike with precision. The second issue is actually breaking local economic networks and long-distance supply chains. National borders remain some of the greatest assets for terrorist groups operating across the continent, as states see borders within which they exercise their territoriality and sovereignty in ways that terrorist groups do not. Because for terrorist groups, they navigate these borders in order to enhance their resilience. And they in fact work to build alliances across regional barriers. So to break local networks and long distance supply chains, it would require building communities of practice, programming and action that transcend disciplinary and professional barriers and geographical spaces as well. And we have heard from previous speakers as well, speaking of the necessity to align military intervention with development interventions, with law enforcement interventions and civilian protection as well, in ways that in fact build the momentum to take back space from terrorist groups and ensure the return of administrative authority. By thinking beyond the purely combat arms prism, in order to optimize counterterrorism and counter-insurgency missions, military interventions would have to move beyond the one-dimensional prism of just combat arms. A lot of militaries around the continent have civil affairs units, they have civil engineering units as well, and health units, which could provide the kinds of services in supplement to the combat arms units in spaces where they have to degrade and destroy and then occupy spaces previously controlled by violent extremist groups. And it would be useful to develop the political will and the expediency to actually deploy all of these in concert to degrade terrorist groups where they exist and to also ensure the return of administrative and civil protection capacities. And finally, and certainly not least, is the fact that in these spaces and in the responses to terrorism and violent extremism, gender matters. Gender cannot be treated as an afterthought, and I'm comforted here that I'm sitting on a panel as the only male speaker today, because women are an essential part of the prevention of violent extremism and responses to effectively counter terrorism as well. And they cannot necessarily exclusively be treated as victims. Therefore, we need to dedicate as much resources to the rehabilitation of women in spaces of violent extremism as we deal with investing in other actors. While we know more now than we did 20 years ago about terrorist groups, we are still lagging behind on the synchronization of policy, research, programming, and practical interventions. Therefore, there is the need to base a lot of interventions, not necessarily on knee-jerk responses, but on empirical analysis and on an empirical basis. States would have to make very difficult public policy choices, particularly within the context of COVID, where they have to respond to the terrorist threat, while at the same time ensuring that they respond to the public health challenges posed by COVID-19 to effectively counter the human resource, economic and geographical resilience and adaptability of violent extremist groups and terrorist organizations. They must also take quite a bit of responsibility for the terrorist dynamics within their borders, and which also straddle their national borders with other countries. And this would require quite a bit of innovation, political will, governance action, and concerted effort, not just from a regional basis, but from an interregional basis and on a continental basis as well. And I'm equally comforted that we have the African Union represented on the panel here today. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end there, and I thank you for your kind attention, and over to you, Nerina.
Thank you very much, Fonte, for your remarks. And again, highlighting the need really for empirical evidence, highlighting the gendered responses going beyond borders, and good to see us, moving more and more towards the recommendations. Before we go to the next panelist, just a reminder to all participants that you can pose questions in the chat so that we will then collect all the questions and pose them to the panelists. So now moving on to Fatima Akilu, the Executive Director of NEEM Foundation. One of the key recommendations of the ASWAN Forum 2 preparatory workshop entitled Terrorism in the Shadow of the Pandemic is adopting a people-centered, whole-of-society approach, which engages civil society organizations in the planning and implementation of national and communal interventions. CSOs are a critical link between governments and affected communities. NEEM Foundation, particularly, has developed several mechanisms that respond to the needs of affected communities and defectors, as well as early warning mechanisms to identify and address signs of radicalization. What are best practices and lessons learned pertaining to CSO partnerships with national governments, regional and international organizations that respond to the threat of terrorism? How has the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic affected these partnerships? And more importantly, how can CSOs play a more active role in building trust between affected communities and national authorities in critical times like these, particularly in border zones? Over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Nerina. And it's a great honor to be invited to address the second ASWAN Forum to make a few remarks on civil society partnerships in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is safe to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has called all of us to readapt and change the way we operate in the countering violent extremism space. Changes have included how we do our work, as well as how we form new partnerships or even maintain the existing ones. This has come with both challenges and opportunities. In Nigeria, we're witnessing a spate of violent extremism across the majority of the country, but more specifically across the northern, western, and northeastern states. It's been in the news lately that we've had a spate of school kidnappings across both the north and the eastern states. Terrorists, be they ideologically driven or bandits, are increasingly operating in ungoverned spaces and adapting their strategies, winning new recruits in areas that are often beyond the reach of national government, international organizations, who are often very reluctant to deploy staff into these spaces that are very unsafe. This then results in a truncation or total absence of programming, such as access to safety and security measures for citizens, but also nutrition, food aid, health, education, and psychosocial services. What this has done is then it's left local and national civil society organizations to carry the burdens, often with extraordinarily little support. Funding has also been more and more diverted to dealing with the pandemic, limiting CVE and PVE programming, as well as resources for capacity building for small organizations that have seen their work grow exponentially in the last year. They are also the faces in most border communities and unreachable places where we don't have government and international organizations. In addition to this, they face reduced or no support to make necessary adaptations, such as the provision of face masks or sanitization equipment. So what we have witnessed is a broad change in how we as civil society do our work. On the other hand, we have seen terror groups consolidate and cooperate across countries, ideologies, and divergent goals to advance their aims. Governments, international organizations, and civil society all have their own unique strengths when it comes to combating terrorism, but decades of global terrorism has taught us that no group, institution, or entity alone can successfully combat the threats that we currently face. We need an all-of-society approach. I know that we say this often, but I don't say it lightly at all. I have been in government and now I'm in civil society, and I know that this allows us to share capacity, strengths, knowledge, and resources across government at all levels, federal, state, and local, as well as international organizations, regional bodies, and civil society. It is the only way to tackle terrorism in both the long and the short term. As I've been asked to talk about practical partnerships between regional bodies, international organizations, and government and civil society, I would like to highlight a few examples of some of the good partnerships to combat Boko Haram on the African continent that my organization, Neem Foundation, has been involved in. The first is the work of the Lake Chad Basin Commission, who have worked very hard over the last year despite the COVID pandemic and the increased encroachment of Boko Haram, to develop a communication strategy to counter Boko Haram. This effort has included the governments of Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, as well as the United Nations Development Commission and civil society organizations like Neem Foundation, but also across each of the 4 countries. We have provided research and as well as strategic input into this communication strategy. Secondly, at the African Union level, it has got together with the Lake Chad Basin Commission to develop a regional strategy for stabilization, recovery, resilience that focuses on screening, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of terrorist subjects. This is the first time that these 2 bodies and regional governments are coming together to work with civil society in terms of the rehabilitation, reintegration, and reinsertion of terror suspects. It has resulted in a greater harmonization with civil society and now with governments in designated rehabilitation and centers. The CSOs help conduct research, and in particular, Neem Foundation psychologically profiles detainees in government detention centers, as well as bridge the trust gap between members of these groups, governments, as well as the wider community. A lot of the work on rehabilitation and reintegration cannot be done by government alone or regional bodies. It takes the work, imams, teachers, members of communities at all levels to be able to win the trust of former detainees and be able to win the trust of the communities that they are going to be integrated back into. Thirdly, again, the Lake Chad Basin Commission, in partnership with UNDP, has set up the first regional civil society platform intended to work with all member states of the region to come up with comprehensive rehabilitation and reintegration plans. These will then be implemented with a direct support from member states and provide an opportunity for joint learning and documentation of best practice. Fourthly, what we've seen is that women and girls have been disproportionately affected by insurgency and conflict, as well as a lack of coordination by both governments and civil society in the delivery of much needed services for this very vulnerable group. For a lot of these women living in rural or poor urban communities, there's often an absence of governance. The only services they receive are from civil society organizations. Issues to do with gender-based violence, their safety, reproductive health become much neglected. Governments and regional bodies have invested huge resources in developing action plans. I believe that there's probably no country in Africa now that doesn't have an action plan on how to deal with these issues. But what must happen now is that there must be more work with civil society groups to ensure that services are available to these women, including psychosocial. While these efforts have done a lot in building partnerships and acknowledging the importance of civil society in complementing and enhancing the work of governments and international bodies, the recent pandemics has perhaps made the role of civil society even more important. Often they are the only presence on the ground in areas affected by conflict, or they are the first presence. They work with both victims and perpetrators and can be a bridge between governments, regional bodies, and international organizations in articulating and understanding local grievances, supporting early warning mechanisms, being repositories of local knowledge, gathering data that enhances our understanding of conflict and the communities most affected by it. They are also often the very first to flag issues such as activities by non-state armed groups in remote areas. This has shown me that when people are empowered to take responsibility for their communities, whether it is in organized groups, as businesses, or as human rights defenders, community organizers, other civil society entities, to support the services of governments and regional bodies, in a whole of society approach, everybody is the beneficiary. I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fatima, and also for highlighting a good practice of what has been mentioned several times in terms of engagement of different actors. So talking about the Lake Chad Basin Commission, highlighting the need for trusted actors, particularly at local levels, who are able to connect the international, national, and community levels. Thank you for those remarks. On this note, I would like to pose a question to all of the panelists, and we're moving forward in terms of concrete recommendations. Several have already been highlighted in terms of analysis, complementing hard approaches with soft approaches. The whole of society approach has been mentioned several times. The need for different responses and innovation. It would be very good to hear more about that, scaling up good practices, focusing on border regions. So I would like to ask all of the panelists, in concrete recommendations, what critical actions need to be taken at the international, regional, and national levels to prevent new waves of radicalization and extremism conducive to terrorism, while also laying the foundation for sustainable peace and development? So I'd like to ask the question in the same order as the speakers made their initial remarks and pointed questions. So we will be beginning with Gada Wali, Executive Director of UNODC. Over to you, Gada.
Hello. Would you please repeat the question, Narina?
Yes. So to repeat the question, it's about recommendations. Mm-hmm. So in terms of concrete recommendations, what critical actions need to be taken at the international, regional, and national levels to prevent new waves of radicalization and extremism conducive to terrorism, while also laying the foundation for sustainable peace and development?
Okay. Among the first recommendation is the recommendation of the importance of working together, regional entities and organizations, donors, civil society, private sector, and other stakeholders. So working together, because no one country and not one entity can address this alone. Second thing is investing in education, investing in jobs, giving youth hope. When youth are given hope, a good education and a good job, it is more difficult to attract them to radical organizations. Also contributing to peace and security through strengthened measures against transnational organized crime, against violence, against drugs, the protection of Africa resources from illegal exploitation by safeguarding Africa's economies from corruption and economic crime and illicit financial flows, and by helping build more effective criminal justice systems and capabilities. Those criminal justice systems, if strengthened, will bring to justice anyone who would threaten the peace and security in Africa. So stronger institutions, educating youth and giving them hope, working together cross nations, cross regions, and facilitating the exchange of views, information, contacts, and best practices between the different parts of the world. There are best practices in reintegrating youth and preventing radicalization, in bringing communities together and investing in communities. So I think it is very important to continue to support the platforms which promote coordination and enabling the sharing of knowledge, expertise, and best practices, and which facilitate discussions on the way forward to better counter organized crime, illicit financial flows, and terrorism. And the Aswan Forum is one of these platforms where there is a serious discussion and a grouping of experts, policymakers, politicians, to share the views and to discuss the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those recommendations. Move on to Michelle.
Thanks a lot, Nerina. This year, as I said, commemorates the 20th anniversary of the attacks 9/11. And I think that this year especially gives the international community a welcome opportunity to reflect on our counterterrorism efforts over the last 2 decades. We must examine both our successes, but also our shortcomings, and lay the groundwork for more comprehensive and agile counterterrorism and CVE responses to our common challenges. And we shall continue to do this throughout this year, including in the context of the General Assembly's 7th biannual review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, as well as the Security Council's consideration of CTET's mandate renewal. And that process, I'm sure, will prioritize certain key issues. First, there is the issue of balance. The last 20 years have brought the investment of significant resources in hard counterterrorism measures, including through the provision of training, capacity building, and security assistance. This work must, of course, continue, but more effort will be required to address the conditions conducive to terrorism in vulnerable communities, including grievances driven by socioeconomic and political factors. Second, it's also crucial to ensure that our responses to COVID-19 do not undermine urgently needed support and funding for long-term CVE programming, which must be tailored to local context and responsive to a broader regional and transnational dynamic. Third, in the context of the pandemic, we have also seen a proliferation of emergency measures and restriction of certain fundamental human rights, such as mobility and assembly. While such measures have been critical in ensuring public health, we must be careful to ensure that they are rolled back as the threat from the pandemic recedes. There should also be continued efforts to ensure free access for information, as ICT and other modern means of communication are increasingly resorted to by the population during the pandemic. And fourth, the member states must continue to integrate human rights into all CT/CVE policies and to adopt a whole of society approach that engages civil society organizations, religious and community leaders, academia, the private sector, women and youth. It has been underlined by all panelists. And lastly, and that has been also underlined by our male panelists here present, we have to ensure that our counterterrorism measures are both gender sensitive and tailored. The terrorist threat is both multifaceted and constantly evolving, and it continues to be extremely diverse in scope and intensity, and it continues to emerge on new battlefields as the threat landscape evolves. Therefore, we must also continue to focus our attention on identifying new and emerging threats, especially in Africa. I will draw your attention to the possible misuse of ICT and social media for terrorist purposes. It has not been seen that sharply in Africa, but that will evolve in a blink of an eye. In Africa, we have seen the wide-ranging impacts that these new threats can have as they continue to interact with other factors, such as the impacts of climate change, poverty, unemployment and resource shortages. And as I mentioned before, the only way to respond effectively to these challenges is through multilateralism and through enhanced partnerships. Technical and material support and assistance by the donor community and implementing partners would also greatly help counterterrorism and CVE capacity building in Africa. Allow me once again to thank the government of Egypt and its partners for organizing this event. I do thank you. Shukran jazilan.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for those remarks. Fiona, the same question to you.
Thank you very much. The good thing about coming third is that a lot of the points that I would like to raise have already been raised. But I will just perhaps repeat some of them. I think for me and what we see here in the African Union, and this is also reflected in the reform that we are undertaking at the moment, is the need to focus much more heavily on governance and conflict prevention generally, to move away from the purely military or hard security approach to address concerns such as corruption. As I said, we need to move towards much more prevention. We find also, though, that there are a number of challenges in putting items on the agenda of the Peace and Security Council, for example, as preventive actions, because member states assert their sovereignty. They say this is an internal issue. So we need to find innovative ways to address these and to put them onto the agenda of the Peace and Security Council. I think Fatima raised the issue of regional and sub-regional approaches, and she mentioned in particular the Lake Chad Basin Region Stabilization Strategy. I think this is something that we need to replicate in other regions as well. Another issue that has been mentioned, I mentioned it myself and it was mentioned by a number of other participants, is the importance of providing opportunities and really hope to the youth, because these are people, this is the generation that has been completely marginalized and left out of all opportunities, and with very few options left to them, except to either migrate to Europe across rickety boats, or to join either terrorist groups or organized transnational criminal groups. I think another challenge that we find is the weak capacity of states in Africa and the inability of the state in many places, many countries, including parts of countries or sometimes whole countries, to provide public social goods. And this is where organizations like, for example, Al-Shabaab are able to attract new recruits by providing such social goods, and also in particular by providing things like administrative justice to communities that feel that the state is not listening to their concerns. I think another major issue that we need to address is the link between terrorist groups and general peace and security and conflicts in Africa, and the need to really address conflict and to promote conflict resolution. I think with regard to tactical or practical measures that have been mentioned already, things like sharing of information, creating a platform for the sharing of information between member states, between countries. Another issue that has been addressed has been, and related to what I've mentioned already, CVE. There's a concern also of cybercrime. Another concern that we have seen is the link between terrorist groups and organized criminal gangs, and the need for us to enhance the capacity of member states to address their financial and border control measures to close the gaps that allow these groups to finance their actions. And a final point I'd like to mention, which I think has not been mentioned, and we see this with regard to certainly Somalia, which is the country that I'm dealing with most at the moment, that a lot of these groups, these organized criminal gangs, these terrorist groups, they have networks that allow them to transfer funds, that allow them to acquire weapons. And these networks are in neighboring states in some cases, in neighboring regions, but really the networks with organizations and individuals and groups that themselves are not criminal, but whose actions enable criminal and terrorist activity. And I just like to leave it there, because I think this is something that organizations such as CTED and the panels of experts really need to get a much stronger grip on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Fonte, over to you.
Thank you once again, Rina, for giving me the floor. I would like to highlight 4 policy issues. The first one is the necessity to align different scales of intervention in the responses to terrorism and violent extremism. That is the alignment of local, national and regional scales of intervention, because that's what allows for adapting the response, in fact, to the threat which these countries and regions face. The second is to enhance the agility of these responses by basically building degrees of complementarity and that capitalize on the value added that communities have and that they contribute to not only early warning, but also to response. Often, CT measures concentrate on areas where there is already the manifest operationalization of terrorism. However, to sustain their existence, terrorist groups normally depend on long-distance supply chains, which normally, and in many cases, cross to areas where terrorist groups do not necessarily operate. So there is the necessity for states where financial and human resource capacities of terrorist groups are embedded to align with states where terrorist groups are already operational, to try to degrade them through cutting these supply chains. As has been articulated already, there is the need for complementarity of action, and that cannot be said enough. We cannot respond to a threat which is transnational by responding purely nationally. So the transnational threats posed by terrorist groups need to be addressed through multilateral action as well. And that's something that I think we should privilege. And finally, I would like to highlight the fact that there's the necessity to learn lessons from previous and ongoing interventions in ways that they could inform future interventions as well. The absence of lessons learned basically leads to us making the same mistakes over and over again. And learning those lessons would allow us or the global community to develop responses which address which are context specific already and anthropologically embedded and based on the reality on the ground, and that disentangle the ties that bind violent extremist groups and terrorist groups to communities, particularly in spaces where the state has limited capacity to act effectively. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Fonte. And now to Fatima with your key recommendations.
Thank you very much. And again, going last means that almost all my recommendations have already been highlighted, but nevertheless, I will summarize them. The first is that a lot of terrorism, especially in Africa, is a direct result of lack of governance. So this allows grievances to build in areas where services are lacking or non-existent. Governments must prioritize these areas and ensure that they're brought into the 21st century with electricity, security, access to education and health should be seen as rights. Secondly, a lot of youths are being ignored, so their rights and desire for self-determination and the need for self-actualization is often truncated. So they feel marginalized and cut off from the wider society. They lack access to jobs, which has been highlighted, education, sports, political participation programs that allow them to serve. It is really, really critical, especially for us in Africa, that we have this burgeoning youth population, that we enhance platforms for youth development and spaces for them to shine and to contribute and to feel part of a community. We must work harder to counter terrorist narratives and call out hate speech strongly. we must prioritize and memorialize victims of terrorism, and ensure that resources are not spent disproportionately on terrorists to renounce terrorism at the expense of victims. We see that more and more, where a lot of it is on rehabilitation, reintegration of terrorists, but not so much resources are put in terms of rehabilitation of the victims of terror. Making society and communities much more inclusive by fostering a sense of belonging for all, regardless of ethnic affiliation and religion. I feel this is very important because I work a lot with former members of Boko Haram, and one of the key reasons that they give for joining is that they didn't feel they belonged, and Boko Haram gave them that sense of belonging. And finally, this has been said by everybody, strengthening partnerships similar to the ones that have been discussed throughout today. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Thank you once again to all of you panelists, for these key recommendations. I just wanted to mention to everyone that unfortunately, His Excellency the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso could not join due to technical difficulties. However, the organizers of the ASWAN Forum will get in contact with him to get his insights and recommendations, and these will be reflected in the conclusions of the ASWAN Forum. So just to conclude in terms of the recommendations, in going forward, as we have seen, and in the remarks, the contributions, and in the wrap-up, there was resonance of particular issues. The element of partnerships, and I'm very pleased to see that with everyone on the panel today, we are engaged in partnership as UNDP, specifically in the field of prevention and response to violent extremism. The need for ongoing analysis has really been highlighted as we see the threat and the consequences of violent extremism, the actions, they have not abated, but it is to fully understand what are the current trends, what are the impacts, particularly in terms of COVID response and recovery, and how do we look at this in the medium and long term. Just to mention also in terms of analysis and research, in partnership with EGAD, Center of Excellence on Countering and Preventing Violent Extremism, we are doing a 2-year study looking specifically at the Horn of Africa region. There's also been analysis that has been done in the Lake Chad Basin region. And also in terms of implementation, Fonte had highlighted also linking practice, feeding that up into the analysis elements. And on our part, we're working in partnership with 21 countries, and part of the practice of the implementation that is going to feed into analysis broadly, which we will share in terms of what has been the impact of COVID-19 in PVE programming, and also as mentioned in terms of implementation of action plans and strategies, not just at a national level, but we are more and more looking at a sub-regional level, so looking at the regional responses. The other element that has been highlighted in terms of these VE groups is addressing the narratives. It has been mentioned that there's been support to the Lake Chad Basin Commission and MNJTF in developing a strategy on communications, trying to degrade these narratives. We are supporting the implementation of this strategy, and more broadly, the issue of hate speech, online and offline spaces, engaging with trusted messengers, looking at engaging with local community radios, looking at religious leaders, and trying to provide counter or alternative narratives to this. A key area as we look at more of the medium and long term is the recovery and the socioeconomic recovery. A number of risks have been mentioned: the diversion of resources, the focus on response. We have seen a general trend in terms of reduce of funding to conflict prevention, peace building efforts. So how do we better integrate the lens of PVE within socioeconomic recovery? We had done a study measuring the economic impact on violent extremism in Africa. Other elements have been highlighted in terms of illicit fund flows, and the links with organized crime. So how do we integrate these elements so that it's not a standalone health response? As we know, there are broader elements to look at. The issue of borderlands has also been highlighted as key focus of interrogation, and also looking at local solutions and scaling those up to more regional and continental responses, looking at best practices and lessons learned. We recently launched as UNDP the Africa Borderland Center that is specifically meant to be doing this. And we've launched an innovation challenge this year to try and address these kinds of challenges, and specifically looking at issues of displacement and youth. So I just wanted to highlight, those main points and picking up upon what others have mentioned in the panel. As I said earlier, we do engage with all of you. So I think in terms, of the partnerships, I think that is key. And as mentioned, the ASWAN Forum has also brought all of us together, from governments, the policy makers, the regional institutions, practitioners, civil society, and also having voices of both men, women, youth represented in these panels. So on that note, I just wanted to thank you all once again for your participation. A special thank you to all of the panelists for your insights, for sharing what you have been working on, for highlighting the key areas we need to look at in terms of short, medium, and long term. And to all of the participants who have been with us, we thank you for your attention. And we look forward to the final report of the ASWAN Forum. Once again, as I started off, I just wanted to thank the organizers once again for the invitation to participate and for convening this important meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.